There are knocks on the door that only a certain kind of person recognizes before hearing them properly. It's not about the rhythm. It's not about the volume. It's something you carry in your stomach long enough to know exactly whose sound that is. It was almost midnight, Friday in June, the kind of cold that seeps through the window even when the window is closed. I was lying in my dorm room bed, not really sleeping, more in that state of someone who stayed still long enough to convince their body they were resting. The desk lamp in the corner was still on, projecting that yellow circle that made the rest of the room darker than it actually was. Outside, the hallway had that same white light, the kind of hospital light that never turns off, that exists without considering whether it's day or night. The knock came in 2 beats. Specific, casual in force, but not in intention. I opened my eyes. I stayed still for a second that felt longer than it was, trying to convince myself there was a simple explanation for that sound. Maybe it was the guy from room 14 looking for a stamp for some document. Maybe the RA with some message about quiet hours protocol. My brain produced 3 reasonable hypotheses in less than 2 seconds. But my body already knew. My body always knows before I do. I got up. I crossed the small room in 4 steps. I opened the door. Gabriel Mendez was standing in the fluorescent hallway, leaning slightly against the doorframe, with the expression of someone trying to seem casual and not quite succeeding. He was wearing the team's shirt faded on the right shoulder, washed so many times the chest print was more suggestion than image. His dark hair had that look of when he'd run his hand back more than once during the day without noticing. 23 years old, 4th year of physical education, informal captain of the volleyball team, with the expression of someone who arrived at this door after an internal calculation I couldn't completely see. I noticed all of this in less than a second. It's a problem of mine. I noticed too many things. Lucas. He said my name like it was both a question and an answer at the same time. Gabriel. I reciprocated the same way, because sometimes that's all you can manage. He raised his hands, showed they were empty, not dramatically, more like someone explaining something and using gestures without thinking. I lost the key to my room. I looked at his hands for a second longer than I needed to. I lost it, he repeated, as if I doubted him. I looked in my pocket, in my backpack, in the locker room after practice. It's nowhere. The RA said the spare key is only available Monday morning. There was something in his eyes. I don't know how to name it right. It wasn't just the awkwardness of someone showing up at a friend's door late at night asking for a favor. It was something else, something that lingered beneath the surface while he explained, something his gaze couldn't quite contain. But at that moment, I didn't allow myself the luxury of analyzing. I allowed myself the luxury of breathing. "Do you want to come in?" wasn't a question. It was a statement. The only possible statement in that moment. Gabriel did that shoulder movement he does when he's relieved, but doesn't want to seem too relieved, if it's not a bother. And that's the problem with the control I spent years practicing. It works straight, in a line, until the moment it stops working. I still didn't know that opening that door was going to cost me the entire system I spent years building. I let Gabriel Mendez into my room. I closed the door behind him, and as I listened to the sound of his footsteps on the wooden floor, while he looked around this small room that I knew every centimeter of, but that suddenly seemed different with him inside, I understood that that night wouldn't be like any other. Sometimes you feel it before anything happens, a kind of weight in the quality of the air that tells you, this moment is going to matter. I went to the bathroom and said I was going to get a glass of water. It was a lie, but it was an excuse good enough to give me 30 seconds alone. I looked at my face in the bathroom mirror and thought, it's okay. You're going to get through this night. It's just one night. You've practiced this. What I didn't know yet, in that mirror at 11:47 p.m. on a Friday in June, was how much practice wouldn't be enough for what that night had prepared for us both. I came out of the bathroom. "Gabriel went in after?" he asked with a chin gesture. I nodded, and I was left alone in the room for the minutes he was in there. 2 or 3 minutes that felt longer than they were, like the moments before a test you know is going to be hard. There's a version of me that people see, and a version they don't. The visible version is adequate. Lucas Carvalho, 22 years old, 3rd year of physical education, volleyball team, good student without being a nerd, friendly without being effusive, the kind of person people like without necessarily being able to explain why. Average height, shoulders that carry more tension than they appear to, dark eyes with the habit of landing on details others don't notice. I move economically, someone who learned early to take up less space than I could. The version people don't see is more complicated. I grew up learning that certain feelings were safe to feel, but not to express. It wasn't an explicit lesson. Nobody sat down with me and told me those exact words. It was more cumulative than that. The sum of observations over the years taught me that my environment demanded a particular version of me, and that particular version didn't include the totality of who I was. I'm gay. It's not a secret to everyone. A few close friends know. But in the context of university sports, I learned early to maintain a safe distance from any situation that could expose what I felt. Not purely out of shame, out of a kind of emotional economy, out of a cold assessment of how much that exposure would cost and whether it would be worth it. The result was that I became very good at 2 things that seem contradictory, but aren't. At feeling everything and at showing nothing. Rafael Souza, my best friend since first semester, is the only place where that system breaks. Rafa is 22, studying the same program as me, living in the dorm room next to mine. And he's the kind of person who asks directly what he wants to know. Not out of tactlessness, but because somewhere along the way, he decided that beating around the bush costs more energy than it's worth. 3 months into our friendship, he asked, "Do you like men or women, or both, or neither?" I should have lied. I had a script ready for that. But Rafa looked at me in a way that made lying impossible. So I told the truth. He made no special gesture. Didn't hug me. Didn't put on a face like, "Wow, how brave of you." He just nodded and said, "Okay," and kept talking about something else. And I couldn't decide if that was the most disappointing or the most perfect reaction I'd ever gotten in my life. With time, I realized it was the most perfect. With Rafa, I almost say things I never say aloud. Things about what I want, about who I am, about feelings that accumulate because they have nowhere to go. But almost is the word that carries the most weight in that sentence. Because Rafa left this Friday for his parents' house, his mother's birthday on Saturday, and the room next door was empty. And Rafa's absence was exactly the reason why what was developing in my room was possible. Sometimes circumstances know things before we do. Gabriel entered my life 18 months ago. It was at the start of second semester, second year, when the volleyball teams got reshuffled and we ended up in the same training group. I already knew him by sight. Everyone knows Gabriel Mendez by sight. That's what presence like his does. But we'd never actually spent time together. The first conversation was about blocking strategy. The second was about a show we were both watching without knowing. The third was almost half an hour after practice, sitting in the empty bleachers, talking about absolutely nothing and absolutely everything. I walked out of that conversation knowing I had a problem. I spent the following months building the system, brick by brick, wall by wall. A set of internal rules that let me be close to Gabriel without risking the equilibrium I'd built. The most important one was what I called internally the law of singular meaning. Every action Gabriel took had only one possible interpretation: friendship. No second layer, no alternative reading. The layer I forbade myself from considering simply didn't exist within the system. It worked. For 18 months, it worked. At least, I believed it worked. Gabriel left the bathroom the way Gabriel does everything, with that lightness in his movement that's half performed, half genuine. He's someone who occupies space naturally, who learned young that space can be yours if you act like it is. Extroverted by habit rather than nature, I learned that distinction over time. The difference between someone who genuinely is that way and someone who learned to be that way because the environment demanded it. Gabriel uses humor as an emotional language, uses physicality, touches, broad gestures, bodily presence, as a way to communicate with people. But underneath the social persona is a man who has never fully examined his own certainties. I watched him from the chair I'd sat in, pretending to check my phone. And I did what I always do when Gabriel's in front of me. I saw him in two simultaneous layers. The first layer is objective. Gabriel Mendes, 23, fourth-year physical education major, informal captain of the team. Dark hair, height that commands without intimidating, the way his shoulders fall naturally relaxed except under pressure. Then they lock, and you learn to read that as an indicator of his internal state if you've been paying attention at the right moments. The second layer, the one I forbid myself from inhabiting, is made of smaller details. The way he listens when he's genuinely interested, different from when he's just being polite. The quality of his attention towards you changes completely, and you notice it if you know what to look for. There's a specific thing Gabriel does that I've catalogued over the last 18 months and have never named directly. 1. The knee that touches mine under the cafeteria table during dinner and never moves away. The law of singular meaning says he simply doesn't notice. 2. The hand that lands on my forearm when he's making a point, lingering a second longer than necessary. The law of singular meaning says that's just how he is with everyone. 3. The shoulder he leans against the wall near my head when he tells a story, as if he specifically needed my wall. The law of singular meaning says, friendship. That's his way. He's like that with everyone. I repeated that argument to myself so many times it wore smooth from use. But there's one specific night that always comes back to me. 2 months ago, the team lost a game we shouldn't have lost. The kind of defeat that sticks to your skin because it's more collective failure than objective disadvantage. Everyone went to bed early. Gabriel and I ended up outside the gym by chance, both leaving at the same time, but neither of us heading in the right direction to say goodbye. We stood there, in the cold of May, with the dark gym behind us. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "How long have we been playing together?" "1.5 years, more or less." "And you're still the person who notices fastest when something's wrong." I didn't know what to say, so I didn't. Gabriel looked at the ground and then at me. "It's a compliment, Lucas. You don't have to look so threatened." I laughed. It was the kind of laugh that hides something else. He didn't notice, or pretended not to. But what stayed from that moment wasn't the words. It was what happened after. He put his hand on my shoulder when he left. A second longer, not out of camaraderie. Something else that I couldn't name without entering territory. I forbade myself from entering. That was the night the system started showing its first cracks. Now Gabriel was in my room, at almost midnight, with the story about the lost key, and I was pretending to check my phone and completely failing at it. Friday had started like most Fridays. Training at 7 in the morning, class at 10, lunch with Rafa that lasted longer than it should have, because Rafa was excited about something about a documentary. And when Rafa gets excited about a documentary, you don't interrupt him. But there was something different about Gabriel that Friday. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of thing you notice and don't notice, that sits on the edge of consciousness, like a sound you're not sure you heard. During training, he was quieter. Gabriel Mendes isn't naturally quiet during training. He's the type who orchestrates the group's energy with comments, who turns repetitive exercises into informal competitions, who uses his own voice as a tool for rhythm. That morning, he was present, executing, but the volume was low. I noticed it. I didn't say anything. There was a specific moment during training when our positions on the field crossed, and I looked up in his direction. Normally, Gabriel catches that. It's in his nature to be aware of when someone's looking at him. But that morning, he looked away before our eyes could meet. Not abruptly, just looked away. After training, in the locker room, it was the opposite. Gabriel made a joke directed specifically at me. One of those jokes that has more affection than humor, that's more a pretext for attention than a punchline. I laughed. He laughed. Things seemed to return to normal. But the two things don't cancel each other out. The looking away and the joke. You don't look away from someone during training and then make a joke directed at that person in the locker room unless you're negotiating something internally. I spent the day keeping that thought in a drawer. Rafa caught me as I left my last class. He had his big backpack on. He was catching the bus to his parents' house that afternoon. "Will you be okay this weekend alone?" "I'm 22, Rafa." That's not what I asked. We walked together to the bus stop. Rafa is the type who creates silence in a way that seems busy. You're never with him and feel that he's absent, even when he's not talking. At goodbye, he put his hand on my shoulder, looked at me for a second that lasted longer than normal goodbyes do. "Be careful what you wish for, huh?" I laughed. What's that supposed to mean? But he was already leaving. I stood at the bus stop for a second after he disappeared around the corner. I dismissed the comment as typical Rafa provocation, who has the habit of planting sentences that seem random and that sometimes reveal, later, that he knew something you didn't yet know. Sometimes Rafa notices things before I do. I still had that thought in the back of my head when the knock sounded on the door at 11:47 p.m. Back to the fluorescent hallway, the open door, the faded team shirt. Now that I had context, the kind of day that day had been, quiet Gabriel from training and joking Gabriel in the locker room, Rafa's comment at goodbye, the image of Gabriel at the door at 11:47 p.m. had a different weight. It had the structure of a narrative I'd been reluctant to see. But while he told me about the key, while I stood in the doorway listening to the practical and logistical explanation, the ID, Monday, the bed in Rafa's room that was locked, there was a parallel process happening beneath it all. I was calculating. Not in a cold way. The way you calculate when your heart has already decided, but your brain is still trying to find a rational way out. "A bed," Gabriel said, looking into the room. "Rafa's room has a bed?" "It does, but he has the spare key. He traveled today." "Ah," a pause. So. Gabriel looked at me. And here's the thing about Gabriel's looks. They're direct in the way that looks from people used to being looked at tend to be. But there's a difference I've learned to distinguish over the last 18 months. There's Gabriel's social look, the one he uses with everyone, which is warm and easy and doesn't demand anything from you. And there's another look, which appears less frequently, that has a different quality, that expects something, that searches for something specifically in you. This was the second kind. "Sorry," he said. "I know it's late." "No, seriously, I can try to call Marcos, see if he—" "Gabriel," I said again, more firmly, more tired perhaps of certain performances. "Come in." He came in. The door closed. We spent the first few minutes negotiating the space like two people being more careful than the situation probably required. Gabriel asked if he could use the bathroom. I said of course. While he was in there, I made the bed as efficiently as possible. I threw an extra blanket that was at the bottom of the closet, adjusted the pillow, made the small, meaningless adjustments that hands make when the mind is occupied with something else. A single bed. That wasn't made for two. The geometry of this situation was, objectively, impossible to treat as purely logistical. When Gabriel came out of the bathroom, he looked at the bed. Then he looked at me. "I can sleep in the chair," he offered. "The chair is an office chair. You'll wake up with neck pain." Then on the floor, "Gabriel, stop." I sat down on the edge of the bed. I crossed my arms. I tried to look exactly like the kind of reasonable friend who wasn't feeling absolutely anything unusual. "It's a bed. We've slept in worse conditions during championship trips. Do you remember, Ribeirão?" He made a sound that was half laugh, half surrender. "That was horrible." "And we survived." He stood there for a second. Then he said, in a tone of voice that was softer than the tone he normally uses, "Okay." We turned off the ceiling light. I left only the desk lamp on its lowest setting. Then I turned off even that. In the darkness, the cold of a June winter seemed more present. The small room seemed even smaller, and the warmth of another human body, lying just centimeters from mine, was physical information that my brain refused to process in a neutral way. I lay on my side, my back to him. I heard Gabriel's breathing. I heard my own heartbeat. Minutes passed. Neither of us said we were sleeping because neither of us was sleeping. At some point, close to 12:15 a.m., when the only sound in the room should have been the silence and the cold, Gabriel spoke into the darkness. "Do you think sometimes we confuse what we feel?" The question fell into the room's silence like a stone into still water. I held my breath, processing the specific weight of those words. "Confuse how?" I said finally, in the voice of someone half asleep, which was completely false. "I don't know." A pause. "Like, we feel one thing and call it something different from what it is, because it's easier, or because we don't have the vocabulary, or because, I don't know, because it seems safer." My heart was beating faster than it should for someone lying still, motionless, in the dark. But I didn't say anything. Gabriel didn't say anything else either. And the silence that followed that question wasn't an empty silence. It was the kind of silence full of things neither of us was ready yet to put into words. It was the most honest question he had asked that night, disguised as generic, planted in the darkness where it was easier to survive. And I held it, warmed, while I pretended to try to sleep. In the darkness, people speak differently. There's something about the absence of light that removes certain filters. Not because darkness makes people brave, but because it removes from the scene the faces, the expressions, the external evidence of what the other person is feeling. You speak to the darkness, not to a person. And that, for some reason I can't explain scientifically, but feel as truth, makes certain words more possible. Gabriel stayed quiet for a while after the question about confusion. So did I. Then he started speaking again, not continuing from where he left off, but from somewhere different. "There was something that happened about 3 weeks ago," he said. "With a guy from architecture school, a friend of Marcos's. We were at a barbecue. It was that one at Gabriel Carmo's, do you remember?" I remember. "This guy, Tiago is his name. We talked on the patio for about 2 hours, just talking. And when I was leaving, I was left with that feeling of, I don't know, of wanting it to have lasted longer." A pause. "That sounds normal," I said. "Good conversations are like that." "Yeah. But then I kept thinking about it for days, Lucas. Like, I kept going back to that patio without meaning to. And I tried to understand why that conversation stuck with me the way it did. Another pause, longer. And the conclusion I came to wasn't the comfortable one. I didn't say anything. "I've never told anyone this," Gabriel said then. And there was something in his voice that I hadn't heard before with that frequency, a kind of raw vulnerability, without the social armor he normally carries. "I don't know if I'm speaking now because it's late or because it's dark or because—" He stopped. "Because what?" I said. "Because you're you." That hung in the air for an amount of time I couldn't quantify. "What do you mean by that?" I asked carefully. "You don't judge." A pause. "At least not in a way that hurts." I kept thinking about it. Gabriel, who looked like he didn't need anyone's approval, who had the social ease of someone who'd always known how to be in any space and make himself accepted. This Gabriel was lying in the dark, telling me that there was a way I didn't judge him that mattered to him. "Sometimes I wonder," Gabriel continued, his voice softer, "what percentage of the things I do because I actually want to, and what percentage is just because it's always been this way. You know? The 'it's always been this way' isn't necessarily the same as 'it's right.'" I processed that in silence. "Like," he said. And now, there was a hesitation in his speech rhythm that wasn't normal for him. Gabriel usually speaks more linearly, without the pauses of someone constructing as they speak, the way I am when I'm with certain people, which isn't the same as how I am with others. "You're speaking very generically for a conversation that feels very specific." A pause, and then, in a way that made me stop breathing for a second. "I know." Silence. "Lucas." My name again, carrying that same mixture of hesitation and urgency. Have you ever felt something you didn't know what to do with?" The weight of that question's irony asked by him, directed at me in that specific context, was enough to produce something that almost became a laugh. I held it back. "Yes," I said, carefully. "Honestly." "How did you deal with it?" I thought for a real moment. "I put it in a drawer, pretended it didn't exist, built an alternative narrative that let me keep seeming normal on the outside." Gabriel was quiet for a long time. "Did it work?" he finally asked. "For a while." Another pause. "Only for a while," he repeated, more to himself than to me. And then he said my name in a way that was different from every other time he'd said my name, with that same quality I'd seen in his eyes at the door, amplified, with something that was no longer just friendship. "There's something I've been noticing for a while," he said, "and I keep trying to put it in the right place. I keep trying to make it fit what makes sense in my head." My pulse hammered at my temples, too heavy for a normal conversation. "What is it?" I said. Gabriel didn't answer right away, and the silence before his answer had its own texture. It was the silence of someone reaching the edge of something and gauging the depth before taking the step. "You." A long pause. "It's you that doesn't fit where I tried to put you." After those words, there was a silence different from all the others. Not the silence of someone thinking. The silence of someone who just did something irreversible and is waiting to see what they've made. I didn't move. I didn't say anything. My breathing had changed without asking my permission. And then, in a sequence of events, my brain recorded in slow motion and memorized in high definition. Gabriel moved. Not dramatically. It wasn't a cinematic gesture. It was small. An adjustment in position that resulted in the warmth of his shoulder against my shoulder. A closeness that exceeded what the bed's geometry required. We stayed like that. Neither of us moved for a time I couldn't quantify. And there was something in those centimeters of contact that was heavier than the physical. It was 18 months of an unnamed language we both spoke accumulating. It was also the specific weight of that night, the question in the dark, the words about Tiago on the porch, the sentence about me not fitting where he tried to put me. It was winter outside, and warmth inside, and the smallness of the room that made it impossible to exist in it without being completely present. And then Gabriel pulled back. Not physically, our shoulders still touched, but something in his energy closed, shifted frequency. He said, in a tone of voice completely different from what he'd used in the last 20 minutes, "There's a beach game tomorrow morning. You going?" The change of subject was so abrupt, it took a second for my head to process that it happened. I understood what was happening. Gabriel had frightened himself. He'd gotten too close to something he didn't know how to name, and the instinct to pull back, the same instinct I'd been practicing for 18 months, had activated. The banter came back, but awkwardly. He made a comment about the team, about a wrong move Felipe had made in practice, about something that didn't matter, and I could have made it easier. It was the moment I would normally make it easier. Enter the new conversation, give him space to pull back, protect the balance of the friendship at the cost of not saying what needed to be said. It was exactly what I'd always done, but I didn't. I stayed quiet. I didn't respond about the beach. I didn't engage with the Felipe comment. I didn't fill the silence with anything that would make the pullback more comfortable. I lay in the dark, breathing, and let the silence be silence. Gabriel realized he hadn't been met halfway this time. The pause that followed was different from all the other pauses that night. There was in it a kind of new weight, the weight of a retreat that didn't work. The weight of two people who know that the previous conversation can't be undone by a question about beach volleyball. He stopped talking. The silence settled in for real. It was the kind of silence that has texture, that you can almost touch, that asks for something to be said, but also knows that what's said won't be able to be taken back afterward. I remained paralyzed, waiting, not as a strategy, as the only thing that felt honest. And then Gabriel, in the darkness, took a deep breath that I heard clearly, and shattered the silence again. Lucas. My name again. But this time, it was different from all the times before. It didn't have that casual quality, didn't have the performed lightness. It was a name said by someone who had reached a dead end, not in a tragic way, but the way certain truths arrive when you finally stop running from them. I clenched my fingers on the blanket, waiting. I don't know how to say this. A pause. This isn't normal for me. I don't have ready-made words for this. It's okay, I said quietly. You don't need them. Silence. These 18 months, he began. Stopped. Started again. Since we really got to know each other, I started noticing things. About how I am when you're around. About how I seek you out, you know? Not consciously. It's more automatic. You're in the room and something in me. He didn't finish the sentence, but I finished it mentally, because it was the same sentence I had built about him dozens of times, with the same ellipses, with the same point where words failed. And I kept telling myself it was friendship. Gabriel's voice was different now, softer, more stripped bare. That of course it's friendship, that's what it is. And there are days I completely believe that. And other days it's harder to believe. A pause. Like today. The air seemed to vanish from the room. When I knocked on that door tonight, he said, and his voice was even lower now, deeper. I knew where the key was. The world stopped for a second. "What?" I said, very quietly. I knew it was in my pocket. I deliberately put my hand in the wrong pocket outside, and then came here. A long pause. I didn't plan it exactly. It was more, I couldn't resist. I needed a reason to be here, and the key was the most obvious reason. I was processing that. The key was in his pocket. It had been there all along. And there was something in that revelation that could have been anger. Feeling like I'd been manipulated, made a fool of. That the entire situation had been a farce. It could have been that. But it wasn't. Because I understood. Understood completely, in a way that's only possible when you recognize in another person something that also exists in you. What it means to need a reason to cross a threshold you can't cross alone. How many times had I built reasons? How many times had I needed an excuse to be honest? "Gabriel," I said. And there was something in my voice that was different now too. Something I'd held back for 18 months that was coming to the surface not explosively, but with the inevitability of water finding its level. "Lucas, tell me something." His voice was tense in a way I didn't recognize in him. "What do you feel for me?" And there it was. The question I had practiced avoiding. The one I'd built an entire internal system to never be asked. Asked. I could have pulled back. It was the moment my internal system would have activated automatic retreat. "We're friends. You're confused. That's not it." I had a script of denial ready and rehearsed, but I'd spent 18 months pulling back. And I'd chosen, when Gabriel pulled back hours before, not to make his retreat easier. It was time to be consistent with that choice. I began, and my voice came out different than I planned, more direct, more defenseless. I spent the last 18 months building an elaborate system to never have to answer that question, and the system worked, until tonight. Silence. "Why?" he asked. "Because I'm gay, and you were supposedly straight, and the math of the situation didn't have an answer that didn't end in some kind of defeat for me." A pause. "And because what I feel for you, Gabriel, what I've carried for 18 months with nowhere to put it, is big enough that the idea of risking and losing was worse than the idea of never trying at all." The silence after that had a different quality from all the silences before. It was the silence of after. Of after the words that couldn't be said were said, and the world didn't collapse. I heard Gabriel breathe. "I like you in a way that scares me," he said then, quietly, without any of the armor he'd worn all night. "I don't know exactly how to name it. I don't know what it means for who I am, but I know it's real, and I know it's you specifically." I couldn't look at him and not feel, but that night, for the first time, I didn't need to pretend otherwise. We moved at the same time, not rehearsed, not with grand gestures. The way two bodies move when the space between them finally becomes indefensible. What happened next doesn't need elaborate words. Sometimes the most important stories of life happen in silence, with the lights off, with the cold outside making the warmth inside even more present. What matters is that two men who had come to that bed as friends in a tight spot were no longer that by dawn. When Saturday's light came through the window, it was slow and pale, the kind of winter morning that doesn't arrive on time. I woke up before Gabriel. I looked at the ceiling for a while, taking inventory of what had changed. Waiting for something to tell me it had been a mistake. That morning would have that effect morning sometimes has, of making the things of the night smaller than they seemed. But it wasn't. Gabriel woke up gradually. I watched him emerging from sleep with a slowness that was his own, the slowness of someone used to not needing to be anywhere urgently. He blinked, turned his head toward me. Our eyes met. There was in his gaze an assessment that lasted less than a second. The assessment of someone checking whether the world had changed, whether what was said was still real in daylight, whether something would be taken back. But there was also something simpler. He was present, completely present, without the evasive gaze that was his Friday habit. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning." We were quiet for a moment that wasn't uncomfortable. Then Gabriel moved, sat on the edge of the bed, picked up his pants from the floor. He still had on yesterday's clothes, Friday's. Started to put them on, and stopped. Put his hand in the pocket, pulled out the key. The key was there. The same key that had been the pretext for the entire night. There, in the right pocket, exactly where it had been from the beginning. Gabriel looked at it for a while, then looked at me. And there was in his gaze something that wasn't shame. It was more complex than that. It was the expression of someone who fully recognized what he'd done and couldn't bring himself to fully regret it. "It was here," he said. "I know." "You've known since when?" "You told me last night." "Oh." A pause. "So you knew?" "Yes." Gabriel looked at the key again, then at the floor, then at me again. "I don't know if I should apologize," he said. "You don't need to." "I do." "Gabriel." I felt something that approached tenderness, not the romantic kind from novels, but the honest kind, the kind that emerges when you see someone wrestling with a truth that is genuinely new to them. "I understand. You needed a reason that wasn't you saying directly what you were feeling. The key was that reason." He looked at me for a while. "It's pathetic," he said. "No." I sat down too. "It's human. I spent 18 months building systems, so I wouldn't have to say directly what I felt. Your version was one night with a key in your pocket. Mine was a year and a half of very well-structured self-deception." A corner of his mouth rose. It wasn't quite a full smile, but it was close. "You're much more articulate than you seem," he said. "Only when it matters." We sat on the edge of the bed, the key between us in a metaphor more obvious than either of us would have chosen. And there was a new lightness in the room that hadn't been there the night before. Not the lightness of everything being resolved. There was much to resolve. Much conversation that needed to happen at some point. But the lightness of two people who crossed a threshold and who, on the other side, discovered that the world was still whole. Gabriel put the key back in his pocket, looked at me. "I'm going to my room to get clean clothes," he said. "Can I come back for breakfast?" It was a simple question, but it wasn't simple. It was the question of someone asking for permission to continue. So that this wouldn't be a night that ends alone, closed off, withdrawn back into the systems that both of us had spent so much time building. "You can," I said. He left. The door closed behind him, and I was alone in the room for the first time since the knock had sounded on the door the night before. There's a version of this story where I spend the next few minutes in ecstasy, jumping with internal joy, replaying every detail with a fixed smile on my face. This isn't the real version. The real version is that I sat on the edge of the bed, looking at where Gabriel had been, and felt something more complex than joy. I felt the sum of 18 months of containment reaching an end. I felt the weight of everything I had stored away in drawers being, at the same time, validated and released. And I felt, this is the part that's hard to name without sounding pretentious, but is true, a kind of anticipated longing. Not for Gabriel, who had left 10 minutes earlier to get clean clothes, but for the Lucas who had existed yesterday. The Lucas who had spent so much time learning to hold back that the holding back had become his identity. That Lucas went somewhere that night, and I was still learning what it was to be what remained. The lost key wasn't Gabriel's room key. It never was. It was the key to that enormous silence he carried about who he was and what he felt. It was the key that he needed to pretend he'd lost, because he still couldn't open it alone. And there was something in that image that I recognized in a way too intimate not to move me. The key that you need someone to help you find is usually nowhere outside of you. It was in the pocket all along. For 18 months, I had practiced control as a form of survival. I had convinced myself that holding back what I felt was the only responsible alternative. That exposure would cost more than silence. And there was reasoning for this. It wasn't irrational. It was based on real experience, on real risk assessments. But the cost of silence is also real. The cost is a version of yourself that grows increasingly distant from who you could be if you could be whole. Tonight didn't cure me of anything. That's not how it works. There are still complicated things ahead. Conversations Gabriel needs to have with himself about what tonight means for the identity he had built. Conversations I need to have with myself about what it means to finally let something real happen after so long believing it would be safer not to. And I need to call Rafa and tell him, because he already knew, somehow, before I did. The goodbye comment wasn't random. It never is with Rafa. But there's a difference between yesterday and today. Yesterday, I was someone who had learned that loud courage wasn't for me. That risk wasn't worth it. That control was protection. Today, I'm someone who discovered another kind of courage. The courage not to make your own retreat easy when the situation asks you to stay. The courage to stay quiet while silence does its work. The courage to say, when asked directly, what you carry, without the shield, without the law of singular meaning that protected but also limited you. This courage doesn't make noise. It doesn't look impressive from the outside, but it's the one that matters when all that's at stake is who you'll be the next morning. If you're listening to this story and recognize something of it in yourself, the elaborate system, the drawers, the law of singular meaning you used to survive in an environment that never asked you to be whole, I want you to know one thing. What you felt listening to this story, that mixture of recognition and relief, wasn't just yours. It never was. What you feel isn't excess. It's not a burden. It's not something that needs to be managed forever in silence. It's you being real in the only way you know how to be real right now. And sometimes, the thing that seems lost was in your pocket all along. If this story touched something in you, leave a comment here. I read them all. And if you want to keep going on this path of stories that mirror what you carry inside, subscribe to the channel. There are more stories where this one came from. Stories about quiet courage, about connections nobody saw coming, about the cost of silence and the value of finally speaking. I heard the sound in the hallway of Gabriel's footsteps approaching. I breathed, and I went to open the door.